Depression. Everyone gets sad every once in a while. After all, we're just human. But depression is not your ordinary sadness. It's a heavy cloud that lingers for weeks, months, or even years. Imagine trying to move through life with a weight attached to your ankle. Everything feels slower, harder, and duller. Plus, the chains hurt. Activities that would ordinarily bring you joy feel uninteresting and meaningless. Simple tasks like taking a shower or replying to a text message seem monumental and draining. In fact, some people with depression will let trash pile up so high that moving around the home becomes a challenge. Often, this aversion to any task comes with lingering guilt for not doing more, which in turn adds an extra layer of stress. Today, over 280 million people worldwide struggle with depression. On the positive side, however, treatment options for depression have quickly advanced and now include mood-stabilizing drugs on top of conventional therapy. Autism spectrum disorder. Many autistic people describe autism as seeing the world in high definition. They are extra sensitive to patterns, details, and sounds that everyone else seems to ignore. However, this keen awareness often comes with sensory overload, like lights feeling too bright or sounds seeming too loud. 1 in 54 children suffer from autism, although to varying degrees, which is why it's called a spectrum. If you're autistic, social interactions might feel like others are speaking a foreign language. Others intensely focus on interests that bring them joy, like painting or playing a musical instrument. Others still might display delayed speech development. Regardless, for those on the spectrum, simple things like a crowded room can feel uncomfortable and overwhelming. On the flip side, most find comfort in familiar routines. Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all treatment. Instead, treatment plans are usually focused on maximizing the person's ability to function by reducing the autism symptoms and supporting their development and learning. Bipolar disorder. Try to imagine a roller coaster ride. It starts off slow and boring. However, as it reaches the top before a steep plunge, your excitement goes through the roof and the adrenaline is out of this world. If you've got that picture in mind, then you can almost imagine what being bipolar feels like. Almost. Bipolar disorder is like being on a mental roller coaster with extreme highs and lows, but there's a caveat: you don't know when the tempo will change. Bipolar people generally swing between manic and depressive episodes. In the manic phase, you feel on top of the world with boundless energy and optimism, like you could solve world hunger in an afternoon. Then the mood drops. Hard. You feel sad, fatigued, and overwhelmed by the simplest tasks. And we are not talking about mood changes that everyone experiences in a day. Manic and depressive episodes can last days, weeks, or even months. Treatment can help, but managing bipolar often feels like balancing on a tightrope, with constant work to stay centered. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD. This is perhaps the most popular mental disorder that people self-report struggling with. Have you ever seen those videos where someone drops like 100 tennis balls at once in front of a golden retriever? In every one of them, the dog gets excited, but with so many balls bouncing around, it's impossible to focus on just one. That's what ADHD feels like. However, ADHD is more than just being distracted. It's about the brain constantly craving stimulation. This makes it manifest in 3 types: inattentive, hyperactive, and combined. Inattentive ADHD makes it difficult to focus on tasks like reading a page from a book without falling into an urge to check social media. Hyperactive ADHD often means an unshakable need to move or talk. Think of it as feeling like a wind-up toy on full power. Lastly, combined ADHD marries the two to create a mental atmosphere that's energetic, chaotic, and at times exhausting. Contrary to popular belief, ADHD is not a children's thing, as it affects about 366 million people worldwide, with a significant portion being adults. Narcissistic Personality Disorder, NPD. Most people confuse NPD with the normal self-centeredness that's inside every one of us. In real sense, though, NPD is like having a mind with a fan club made up of both fans and haters. For people with narcissistic personality disorder, the world revolves around them. Everyone else is just a supporting character. Ironically, while narcissists might come off as overconfident, they are often masking a brittle self-esteem and a deep craving for admiration. Imagine a friend who thinks they are the smartest in the room but needs constant validation of the same. Round-the-clock recognition by those around them would be important to feed their delusions. Everything they do is done with a selfish, often hidden interest. Any perceived criticism, however, brings them back to reality and can trigger defensive or even aggressive reactions. Unfortunately, even the acceptance they so crave often just intensifies their misplaced belief of self-importance. Around 1% of the global population suffers from NPD. Schizophrenia. If you're like most people, you've probably thought about how it would feel to be a movie star. But what if you one day went to sleep normally but woke up to realize your life is an act happening on an invisible stage that only you seem to notice? Everyone else in the world keeps living the same way, oblivious that there are people listening and watching all of their moves. Unnerving, right? Schizophrenia feels similar. Your senses start hallucinating things that are just not there. For some, this involves hearing voices that no one else can, or seeing things that look vividly real but aren't there. It could also take the form of detecting certain scents without any physical source, or even the unmistakable feeling of someone touching you. Given everyone else's nonchalance about things that seem real to you, schizophrenia is often accompanied by paranoia and delusion. A person might start thinking that there's a conspiracy against them and misinterpret mundane events as confirmation of the fact. With appropriate treatment and support, however, schizophrenics can still live fulfilling lives. Eating disorders. These usually feature a skewed relationship with food. Normally, you don't overthink eating. You get hungry, you eat something, simple. However, for people with eating disorders, factors other than hunger and cravings come into play. Factors like weight, control, comfort, and often deep-seated insecurities. Take an anorexic, for instance. They might have the idea that fat, even in the slightest, is unhealthy. In response, they set rules around food that get stricter and stricter, sometimes to the point of starvation. Bulimia is another eating disorder that involves episodes of overeating. These are usually followed by crashing guilt, which leads to extreme self-correction measures like purging, to undo the overeating. Then there's binge eating, where food becomes an emotional outlet. You no longer eat because you're hungry or crave a certain food. Instead, you start finding emotional satisfaction in stuffing yourself full at any chance you get. The biggest challenge with eating disorders is that food is essential for life. This is why therapy is the best treatment option because of how important it is to rewire the mental model that got someone there in the first place. Anxiety disorder. Imagine you're getting ready to give a big presentation, but you've forgotten everything you were supposed to say. Now multiply that feeling by, say, infinity, and you'll start to understand what it's like to live with anxiety. People with anxiety are like human radars, constantly detecting threats, real or imaginary. Their minds are locked in overdrive, making mountains out of every molehill. Got a weird text from a friend? Must mean they hate you now. Odd look from a stranger? Probably plotting something. It's like having a personal, non-stop conspiracy theorist in your head. For many, anxiety is like having what-if alarms that just won't stop going off. What if I said something weird at that party last month? What if I somehow ruined tomorrow's breakfast? It's an endless loop of hypotheticals, and your brain insists on treating each one as part of reality. So, while the world is sipping on coffee, the anxious brain is preparing for a disaster. With over 260 million people worldwide affected, anxiety is not just feeling a bit nervous here and there, but a full-time job your brain never clocks out of. Post-traumatic stress disorder. When a person undergoes immense trauma, the mind keeps a record so it can avoid similar scenarios in the future. It's sort of an inbuilt self-preservation mechanism. Sometimes, however, this mechanism goes overboard. PTSD is like being trapped in a mental time loop, where memories of your trauma refuse to stay in the past. And it's not just for soldiers or first responders. PTSD can affect anyone so long as a traumatic event is involved. Take a child who grew up in a volatile home, for instance. Even years into adulthood, things like raised voices or dishes breaking might take their mind back to their traumatic upbringing. Essential, everyday sounds, smells, or sights can trigger these flashbacks and force you to relive the event all over again. Other symptoms of PTSD include hyperawareness, nightmares reenacting your traumatic scenario, and emotional numbness that make ordinary life a challenge. Therapy helps, but it's often a long road to recovery. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. Living with OCD is like having an overbearing parent in your mind second-guessing every one of your actions. Just as its name suggests, OCD is a negative feedback loop where intrusive thoughts, obsessions, drive repetitive behaviors, compulsions. Imagine getting the urge to wash your hands again and again because you're deathly afraid of germs, or double-check the locks at least a dozen times, not because you're forgetful, but because your brain insists on it as a safety measure. For some, OCD can manifest as arranging items until they feel just right, while for others, it's having thoughts they can't shake. The problem is that while these repetitive rituals may provide temporary relief, they create and reinforce a cycle that's hard to break out of. Around 2% of people worldwide experience OCD, and it can severely interfere with work, relationships, and daily life. Trying to ignore these urges is like holding back a sneeze. It takes enormous energy. Not to mention the mental anguish that follows the intrusive thoughts. What if today is the day when that bad thing finally happens? Fortunately, cognitive-based therapy and medication can help break the feedback loop. The most mind-blowing fact about mental disorders is that while the solution might seem obvious to you, the person suffering through it is in an altered state of mind they are completely powerless to. It's like losing a loved one and someone comforting you like, "Don't be sad, we'll all die someday." While true, that wouldn't make you feel any better, would it? This is why it's important to practice empathy and understanding while dealing with those of us struggling with mental disorders. If you like this video, subscribe for more. See you in the next one.